but I'm hobbled, I'm afraid, by the many accomplishments of our distinguished presenters. Stanley Plumley is Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland at College Park, and the author, I may be wrong on my count, the author of 10 volumes of verse, which he has received numerous awards and prizes, including fellowships from the Rockefeller and Guggenheim Foundations, the National Endowment for the Arts, and in 2009, the Poet Laureateship of the state of Maryland. Some of us here today, Philistines that we literature professors are, I'll speak for myself, I guess, may know him best, however, through his books on Keats, Posthumous Keats, a personal biography, and most recently, Immortal Evening, a legendary dinner with Keats, Wordsworth, and Lamb, where Keats, rather immortally, and I've been living with this for over 40 years as a Wordsworthian, has long been the enduring beneficiary. It is Stan's achievement here, all the more than in that he is a Keatsian, to have leveled the playing field at this famous event, with special attention, of course, to the host, Benjamin Robert Hayden, but more generally in having gifted this amazing assemblage with the attention, the negative capability, as someone once termed it, that only a poet can finally exert. There was a time, certainly when I was starting out, in the so-called age of criticism, that the person of letters was not only a prevalent formation in our world, but frequently a leader. It's a pleasure then, particularly in this age of new knowledge, to witness someone moving like Stan with such fluidity and command. Susan Woolston is professor of English at Princeton University and the author, in addition to her fugitive poetry, of numerous critical studies, including The Questioning Presence, Formal Charges, Romantic Interactions, Borderlines, and most recently and appositely, Reading John Keats. A new study, Romantic Shades and Shadows, is forthcoming next year. Susan, too, has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, notably the Humanities Trifecta of Fellowships sponsored by the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council for Learned Societies. In a career marked by many extraordinary readings of both the Romantics and their contemporaries, it's hard to single out a particular Woolston moment to focus on by way of introduction today. But my personal favorite, at least regarding Keats, has long been Susan's pairing of Fall and Autumn, that is, the Fall of Hyperion and to Autumn, which she reprises in the penultimate chapter of the new book. Much like her subject, she saves the best for last. With an assist from an accidental neologism, philanthropy, coined by Keats in a letter to Benjamin Bailey, Susan sums things up with an intertextual richness that, if not strictly punning, on the poet's model comes pretty damn close. Keats, she writes, knows on his pulses the anatomy of melancholy, and the love of its trophies, and contrarily the disposition of indolence. He knows the uncomfortable hours and the luxury of hours that seem otherwise. Poised between the mind of winter and the songs of spring, to Autumn writes up the wistfully complicated interval in between. In anticipation of a complicated but presumably less wistful interval, please join me in welcoming our featured interlocutors.
Mostly what I do in front of audiences is read my own poems. I don't get to talk about other poets, especially the great Keats, but rarely. And so I truly appreciate this opportunity. On July 17, 1797, Coleridge writes his friend Robert Southey that he has found his new friend, William Wordsworth, and Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy, a grand Somerset house, only 4 miles from his own Nether Stowey, elegantly and completely furnished with 9 lodging rooms, 3 parlors, and a hall, and a most beautiful and romantic situation by the seaside. During the Wordsworth's visit to find the house, Coleridge's best friend, Charles Lamb, has also been a visitor. Walking, whether countryside or city, is the foursome's favorite outdoor recreation. Except that during this moment of company, Coleridge's wife, Sarah, has accidentally or on purpose emptied a skillet of boiling milk her husband's foot, confining him to a lime tree bower the early July evening. His three visitors take a long walk of Coleridge's own designing. The famous and remarkable poem that results is Coleridge's This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, a poem addressed to Charles Lamb of the India House. We all know this poem. What I want to emphasize is the obvious, which is that the whole grounded thing is entirely the work of Coleridge's imagination. He sends his friends on their evening way, then traces in his mind's eye the path they are following, which is to further say that the poet must at once follow what is familiar while making it a discovery. He knows they don't. Lime Tree is essentially a memory narrative based on a picture Coleridge already has in mind, so to speak, as if he is responding to a composition by recreating it. The tone of the poem may be elegiac, even hyperbolic, but its nature is refining beauties and feelings such as would have been most sweet to my remembrance, even when age had dimmed mine eyes to blindness. Blind eyes only elevates the role of seeing by remembering, yet remembering in future time, which is like bringing back the past, can only happen through imagining. A picture of a picture. Coleridge's new friend and colleague at this time is also composing by remembering, if at a profoundly different distance and in a profoundly different voice, replacing celebration with investigation. I'm thinking of part one of Wordsworth's marvelous two-part prelude, composed over the autumn and winter of 1798-99. Part one runs close to 500 lines and is made up of example moments from early childhood, bridged here and there by here and there commentary. It is an early run-through of Coleridge's assignment to his friend to write a philosophical poem. Hence, its around the house title as The Poem for Coleridge. It is, in fact, the seedbed for what becomes the first epic of the self, or more plainly, the growth of the poet's mind. But for our purposes, it is much more interesting than that. Part one establishes the ontological value of childhood as a subject for poetry and determines a method of memory association in which its spots of time take on ultimate and evocative meaning. Memory for Wordsworth becomes in this initial prelude not only the subject, but the episodic source of his art. Whether it is as the naked boy among silent pools, or the fell destroyer, or the rover in high places. The mind of man, Wordsworth concludes, is fashioned and built up even as a strain of music through such memories, one of which memories becomes more serious in the incident of the theft of and haunting by the shepherd's boat, and the ensuing guilt as expressed through unknown modes of being that follow him into a darkness he calls solitude. This theme of solitude then becomes a mainstay in the poem as the spots of time sequence moves from lesser to greater examples of even more numinous memory pictures. Where is Wordsworth headed with these apparently linked and escalated examples? He seems to be feeling his way, a way itself guided by his growing childhood, so that by line 260, the poem kicks into a different mode, a true yet illuminating series of darknesses or spots that, like their archetypes, know no decay and have their first date in our first childhood. The rest of part one is made up of such archetypal moments, though the moments are more like images, evocations, snapshots of experiences, pieces of fabric rather than the filled-out memory narratives of earlier. Yet they are deeper by more than half. They come at the reader in fragments, parts of a larger implied whole, whether the encounter is the ghost body of the wife murderer still hanging from a gibbet mast, or the sequence of resonant piecemeal images of a naked pool, a beacon on a summit, and the girl who bore a pitcher on her head. Images that the speaker cannot explain but feels compelled to respond to. What we might call the capper to this set of experiences comes later on, on a rough and wild summit where the still young speaker, home from school on Christmas holiday, finds himself sheltered by a naked wall with a single sheep on one side of him and a whistling hawthorn on my left, while in the perspective hangs a heavy mist of intermeeting prospects. Suddenly Wordsworth is aware, as if by an epiphany, that ere I to school returned, that dreary time, ere I had been 10 days a dweller in my father's house, he died. And I and my 2 brothers, orphans then, followed his body to the grave. This abruptness of this hard news is placed into the context of a chastisement and associated with the memory of the whistling wind and sleety rain and all the business of the elements, the single sheep and the one blasted tree and the bleak music of that old stone wall, the noise of wood and water and the mist, all of which advanced in such indisputable shapes that they became spectacles and sounds to which I often would repair and thence would drink as at a fountain. Thus the archetypal childhood memory becomes inspirational as well as powerful, a classic fountain of the dark waters of inspiration. What I find creative in both the Coleridge and Wordsworth poems is how the imagination of the moment and the imagination of memory are brought to bear as images, as radio pictures, whether immediate or through time, which is to say, realized in the mind as representations to be represented and processed through the language of their experience. Coleridge maps out from the point of view of his lime tree prison the familiar route his friends are taking by repeating what he knows and what he has told them. He sees a priori in his mind's eye the entity of their journey as a totality, as an at-once event, then writes it for us. Wordsworth spots time through the work of building a sequence of visually and emotionally suggestive self-contained memories that add up as set pieces to the source life of much of his poetry. In part 1, he remembers in terms of images that take on their own independent associative life, then makes of them linked presentations in blank verse. I find it amazing that we are still in the 18th century when this revolutionary change from what Keats in Sleep and Poetry labels the rocking horse metrics of the closed couplet, as it becomes a language that turns toward a deeper strain of music in ordinary, extraordinary minds. The change is no less amazing when you consider the profound degree to which imagination as such comes to supersede enlightenment, wit, and intellect. In 20 short years, the time it takes a second generation of romantics to start to establish itself, John Keats will extrapolate, even elevate, the techniques of autobiographic narrative illustration, whether based in the moment or in memory, into a lyric poetry of transformation, in which narrative is subsumed and autobiography consumed by the object of the poem itself. In other words, he makes autobiographic narrative disappear by absorbing it into an art of something else. In the great poems we revere, there will be no friends nor personal history claimed as generative. Keats's sources in these unsurpassed lyrics will seem to derive from myth and emblem solely, from actual other art itself, from classical symbol, sculpture, or painting, or looked at in a more general way from the greater golden culture of antiquity. If Coleridge and Wordsworth redirect the subjectivity of the poem through discrete example and image as an issue of the self, Keats, at his best, transcends the self in order to treat the poem as an object, as an achieved work of art apparently independent of its direct ties to its author. Or to put it another way, Coleridge and Wordsworth introduce the possibility, while Keats establishes the reality that the relationship between the poet and his or her material, raw or cooked, is ekphrastic. Art responding to art. The imagination of the poem answering the imagination of its source. I would argue that in his 1819 Spring Odes and Into Autumn, Keats sets the standard for what and how inspires the modern poem. Going so far as to say that what we mean by the experience that inspires us must first take on a shape and an identity that we could translate as the seminal image and the first language of that experience. The way, for instance, that the nightingale is real and mythic at once. The way that the Grecian urn is no less a real than it is a composite invention. The way that melancholy is both a paradoxical psychological condition and a commanding goddess, and the way that the autumn harvest must be imagined as a painting drawn from both paintings and mythic configuration before it can be a poem. Much of what I have to say is implied in Ian Jack's brilliant book, Keats and the Mirror of Art, which title he takes from a passage of Hazlitt's On the Pleasure of Painting. Every object, writes Hazlitt, every object becomes lustrous from the light thrown back upon it by the mirror of art. That's how the passage begins. Keats departs from his first generation forebears in exactly these terms. He moves the romantic subject of poetry from the appearance of memory's narrative self-reference to a well-wrought reference outside the self. That is to say, a treatment of experience itself as art, as a source for poetry. Even further, Keats turns the mirror into something like a window. The light thrown back is more refraction than reflection, more imagination than imitation. For what is an image, finally, except an idea with a body? Keats, at his best and most influential, is seeking an embodiment rather than an emulation of the original encounter with the experience of other art? Or is it that he is seeking the art of the experience? Jack does a thoroughgoing job of establishing just how thorough Keats's immersion is in the art world of his time, not to mention the art world of the past. We all know Jack's book. Well, I hope you do. It amounts to a grand chronology of Keats's ins and outs with influences such as Leigh Hunt, Benjamin Haydon, William Hazlitt, and a whole span of literary and genre art, both immediate and classical. He covers Keats's relevant material with remarkable scholarship. His rendition of Keats's Sleepless Night on the short couch in Leigh Hunt's study after one of Hunt's popular dinner parties is an introduction to how he sees the mind of the young poet operating within the context and confrontation of what is in front of him, namely, in this case, the busts of poets, a wonderful and extensive library, and a significant landscape or two. Added to this room of culture is Keats's visit earlier in the day at the British institution, whose walls included relevant works by Titian, Rubens, and Van Dyck. Such eye-filling visual experience makes up a goodly portion of the longest poem in the 1817 volume, a meditation appropriately titled Sleep and Poetry, a poem that Jack rightly notes makes clear how great a debt Keats owed to the sister art of painting. Do I wake or sleep? Will become a keynote in Keats's consciousness. It suggests a state of being or dreaming that becomes generative in his poetry. It is a state of mind, in fact, in which the poet transforms rather than simply translates the object of his experience into the object of the poem. Keats's familiar truth-beauty dialectic is simply another way, it seems to me, of his understanding of negative capability. The active dream state is where the imagination gets its most capable work done. Joy is sadness. Immortality is cold. The nightingale's perfect song heightens my sense of my own imperfection. The September harvest gives life, yet signals it's taking away. To bring to life the imagination is to interrogate the imagination. Curious that for all the breadth and depth of his study of Keats's mirroring of art, Jack does not pay attention to the most prominent art-inspired piece in the 1817 volume, the starter volume of Keats's long and short journey in poetry. That is probably because, on first looking into Chapman's Homer, is not literally based on a literal painting, work of sculpture, or visual forms. It is based on writing, on words, and on a translation at that. And even then, the announced subject, i.e. Chapman's Homer, receives barely 3 direct lines in a filled Petrarchian sonnet. So where is the ekphrastic source in this art? Keats, to say the least, is a quick study. The final and longest poem in 1817, Sleep and Poetry, may suffer too much Huntian efflorescence, but it also strips some genuine insights into the true act of poetry. For instance, that a drainless shower of light is poesy. 'Tis the supreme power. 'Tis might half slumbering on its own right arm. An image that anticipates the understated and relaxed posture of the goddess Ceres in the poet's last great lyric, Through Autumn. It is as well an image picked up again in On Seeing the Elgin Marbles, a sonnet written almost to the day of the publication of poems. How different the setting of Keats's first viewing of the marbles from the waking morning light in Hunt's study. The marbles are amassed in disarray in a large backyard shed behind Lord Elgin's Park Lane property. And how different the usher to this experience when you compare Hunt to Benjamin Haydon, who, for all his obvious faults, knows art and sees it. The parallel lines to Might Half Slumbering on its own right arm occur at the end of the Elgin Marbles poem, when Keats writes that so do these wonders a most dizzy pain that mingles Grecian grandeur with the rude wasting of old time, with a billowy mane, a sun, a shadow of a magnitude. The Elgin Marbles sonnet is ekphrastic, of course, but it is also a definition of where Keats is heading as a poet, where he's coming from. Where he is heading is toward what he will later refer to as a more naked and Grecian manner in his craft, and toward greater disinterestedness and negative capability in his tone. Might half slumbering, a shadow instead of the full sun as the measure of magnitude, and a more naked and Grecian manner add up to a statement of aesthetics that will sustain him. And although these aforementioned insights and references all go back to the plastic arts, they apply everywhere in Keats's approach to the art of poetry, namely the palpable text of a book, writing as idea and image. Chapman's Homer may be the most apparent starting point for Keats's treatment of a text as comparable to the physical presence of art, but it is not necessarily the first. In fact, I would argue that the initial stanza of his very first poem, Imitation of Spenser, is a pretty good example of just that, an imitation as transformation. Now morning from her Orient chamber came, and so forth, represents in the Spenserian stanza a fair picture of a developing dawn as a landscape painting, except the source is words, not paint. The same with Chapman's Homer, but with a vital difference. Keats's homage to Homer ultimately excuses the passing translation of the original in favor of the uses of analogy, or you might say in favor of compatible, verisimilar texts of testimony, texts in the realms of gold, celestial wonder, and wild surmise, texts of imagination. Chapman's Homer, as we know, is Keats's breakthrough poem. The sonnet even Hunt would recognize as having completely announced the new poet taking possession. And as we are all likely familiar with the context of the poem's composition, following an evening of reading George Chapman's 1616 translation of Homer, notably the fifth book of the Odyssey, in the company of his friend Cowden Clarke, I will not belabor the point except to note that Keats is especially struck by the drowning man line in which the sea had soaked his heart through. An image-perfect line, not unlike Keats's favorite sea moment in Spenser, that refers to sea-shouldering whales. Palpable, accurate, saturated detail, sensual, yes, but by all sensual means, visual. Keats, right off the bat in his career, is struck by the truth-bearing, oral, and ocular beauty of the imagination as an act in and of itself. Indeed, imagination as the self-referencing source of its content. But this talent more than foregrounds the materiality and plasticity of language. It represents a perception at the center of Keats's emphatic idea of the chameleon poet, the poet who disappears into the word, whose interest is disinterestedness. I would also pay attention to the fact that this elusive Petrarchan sonnet's inspiration derives from the translated art of another poem in a book, rather than from what we think of as hands-on autobiographical experience. Keats, as was his habit, writes his Chapman poem fast, within hours, overnight, by early the next morning. Keats is always fast at the level of the line, but not always successful. I would further add that the realms of gold immediately removes the poem from narrative reality to the reality of the altered state of the imagination, which is to say, Keats is dealing with his response to reading and mouthing a Greek work of literary art, much as he will soon read into writing his response to the Greek Elgin marbles. Chapman's Homer is a picture of a moment in which the speaker declares his fealty to what Chapman has translated and created, and is therefore transported to a scene of what Chapman's version of Homer's words, is making. There is no outside narrative appealed to, no literal world walked in from in this poem. The speaker-traveler of goodly states and kingdoms seen is given, a dene, assumed and provided, just as the story of the poem plots an enclosed epiphanic narrative. Keats's sonnet art is answering Chapman's art, answering Homer's. Keats feels it. He feels it as an extending emotional and revelatory experience rather than as a fantastical intellectual encounter. Never mind the small improvements, such as deep-browed Homer instead of low-browed. Ignore the mistake of Cortez for Balboa, one too many syllables or beauty over literal truth. The poem is a masterpiece of separation, a proof of the self from the start, objectified as a traveler in realms of imagined memory, round many Western islands. It is a dream projection of the supreme fiction necessary to meet Chapman on his own terms, terms which are to speak out loud and bold and to be heard in silence. And as will be true throughout Keats's linguistic career, the senses of hearing and seeing and feeling will interact as one or in juxtaposition in a vowel-rich synesthesia. So in Chapman's Homer, Keats is immediately disconnecting us from our local world, from the dross of our own familiar narrative realms, and instead issuing a sealed invitation to realms of gold made more golden through Chapman. And the poet does not enter his poem as Keats, nor as someone who meets a traveler from an antique land, nor as Kubla Khan, nor even as stout Cortez, but as a traveler playing traveler in the realm of the wild surmise of the imagination. Wild, yet finally and powerfully silent. If by imagination we mean that which we make from and not make up. And in this case, art made from art, ekphrastic, if you will. I'm running out of time. I wanted to look at the...
Go ahead and do it.
I've been commanded. Poems, other fine piece of writing. And I've got two really beautiful poems in 1817. Obviously, Chapman's poem. But the other poem that no one ever pays attention to is that little lovely moment to my brothers. And they're just getting back together. Keats is still in medical school, so to speak. Poems, the title of the book. Fine piece of writing, otherwise Petrarchian sonnet to my brothers, appears to be made of different metal. Very much of the diurnal world of personal celebration, homecomings and birthdays. Keats, the medical student, is leaving his grungy borough quarters near Guy's Hospital and moving in with Brother George across London Bridge at 76 Cheapside, near Bird in Hand, and taking their younger brother, Tom, with him. It marks the first time since childhood that the brothers will live together. Therefore, Keats's overall warm response to this homecoming encompasses more than just Tom's 17th birthday. The actual setting seems to be set on the chilly evening of November 18 around the homey hearth of a coal fire. I'm going to read this poem, if that's all right. Small, busy flames play through the fresh late coals, and their faint cracklings o'er our silence creep like whispers of the household gods that keep a gentle empire for fraternal souls. And while for rhymes I search around the poles, your eyes are fixed, as in poetic sleep, upon the lore so valuable and deep that I, at fall of night, our care condoles. This is your birthday, Tom, and I rejoice that thus it passes smoothly, quietly. Many such eves of gently whispering noise may we together pass and calmly try what are this world's true joys, ere the great voice from its fair face shall bid our spirits fly. This is certainly a sonnet made of seemingly different metal, but it is closer, I think, to being an alloy of gold and perhaps silver or whatever, at the least a mixture of valuable ore. Moreover, the plot of the poem and its fraternal themes and emphasis on an altered state of sleep, and quiet and calm, echo Keats's connecting with brothers Chapman and Cortez and the pure serene of the octave of the experience and the awe at the end of the earlier sonnet. There is furthermore the brothers' story parallel of the macro realm of household gods and the great voice with a micro scene of small busy flames and many such eves, which comport with the implied reader at a desk or in a chair hearing Chapman speak out loud and bold, and responding, internalizing the oral experience with feeling. Both of these poems enter what might be called a sacred space, one in which the poet answers art with art, the other in which the poet answers with what? I maintain that To My Brothers is no less an answering of art to a moment being read, no less as art. It is a scene elevated within a hyper-context of gods and empires and greatness, while calling attention to itself as writing, as a poetic work of art, searching for rhymes around the poles, within a further, more immediate equivalency of poetic sleep. To My Brothers is, I believe, no less ekphrastic than the Homer sonnet. It presents an immediate scene, self-contained, built from the inside, proposed as the moment over the memory of it, but realized as imagination. The fact of Tom's birthday becomes an elusively autobiographic detail within the homey winter bower of the brothers as one motif. Tom is embedded in the tableau as a kind of pivot from the octave to the sonnet sestet. He is texture among texture, as he will be as youth grown pale and spectre thin in the Nightingale Ode. As writers, we might wish the young Keats had found a couple of other diction choices, always the issue with rhyme. Creep and the odd oxymoron whispering noise are not up to the natural language of the experience elsewhere in the poem. I find condoles, however, to be especially brilliant as it ends the line and the sentence and the octave with wonderful authority. In addition, it summarizes what will prove to be one of Keats's most moving images as well as ideas, that the fall, is the fall of night, the sunset hour, the dusk, the coming on of the dark, all of this is the richness that we respond to and that we care for, that we identify with. It is the hour of the nightingale, the hour of melodies heard sweeter, the melancholy hour, the harvest hour, and even the hour in winter when the sun shuts down too early. It is the elegiac hour. Lore I take to be another elusive gesture toward the joining of the epical adventures of Homer and of Cortez. And the great voice and his fair face may return to the allusion to household gods, but I think these macro references are more interesting and problematic than that. They are pagan at the least, and they seem to have the world of art behind them. The great voice of an anonymous Homer, and the fair face of a ubiquitous Greek god, say Apollo, or a face from the Elven marbles. These gods, their collective voice, want to make our spirits fly, which is no less an image of the phoenix than it is of mortality. It anticipates how Keats ends his homage to Shakespeare's Lear. Give me new phoenix wings to fly my desire. Death and rebirth as art. And the fair face is also the fairer side of the coin that will have Monita's awesome face on it, a one face, not pined by human sorrows, but bright blanched by the immortal sickness which kills not. It had passed the lily and the snow. At its best, Poems of 1817 is a foundation for what will follow in Keats's amazing and accelerated growth as a poet. I find these two 1817 sonnets to be notably exemplary in that regard. They look forward to Keats as a deep elegist, a profound lyricist, and a consummate formalist. But that is only the beginning of the achievement. They look forward to the sympathetic contract with and empathic connection to the sources of his material. Keats, first of all, changes the style, what Eliot calls the imagination, or the auditory imagination of a poem. Yet even more, he lifts the visual complexity and intensity of the lyric moment, which is to say, he raises the bidding on texture, on the flesh and blood and organic internals of the poem. Beyond these crucial qualities is the test of what he speculates in his great letters, the concept of negative capability, the authenticity and truth of the imagination, the holiness of the heart's affections, the fact that the excellence in every art is in its intensity, the realization of a poem is more naked and Grecian in its craft, the rejection of poetry that has a palpable design upon us, and most of all, the insight that that which is creative must create itself. All but the last of these perceptions generated out of his correspondence of 1817. My contention is that from 1817 on, Keats has a pretty fair intuitive grasp of the argument he is making in both the poems and the letters as to what as a poet he is after, in spite of the sometimes poor or provisional decisions about what to include in his books and what to leave out. He is, in effect, conducting a workshop with himself. And I just go on from there.
Well, what stanza generously cut out will be, we hope, in the Keats-Shelley Journal. So that's just an anticipation of something ever more about to be. Thank you, everyone. I've really learned so much today, and am humbled by parts of Keats and Keats' situation that I've just taken uncritically and have had productively complicated for me today. So this is about Keats' emergence as a poet in 1817. That was our rubric. That was our theme for today. And it is a tad somewhat overspecified, partly because everybody seems to have moved backward and mostly forward from 1817. This may be because emergence is the very arc of Keats' career, stopped only by death, but even with the continuing afterlife of surprising emergences, as our gathering here and the papers we've read today testify. The emergence in 1817, of course, had been in formation for years. From school days on, Keats' heart beat for poetry, reading it, writing it, dreaming of being a poet. I find I cannot exist without poetry, he told his fellow poet friend John Hamilton Reynolds in April 1817. Yet the vocation was scarcely an open call. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, they all had university educations and some connections. Even Felicia Hemans, Keats' near contemporary, was homeschooled by a devoted mother, and her early efforts at poetry were encouraged by family and by friends who sponsored her first publications. Keats did enjoy a liberal education at Enfield Academy, generously mentored by the headmaster's son, Charles Calvin Clark, but this fertile field came to an abrupt close in 1811, when at the death of his grandmother, his parents already no more, Richard Abbey, her appointed legal guardian, yanked Keats out of school and apprenticed him to an apothecary. This followed by study in surgery at Guy's Hospital in London in the grim days before anesthesia. Always the ace student and a demon with Latin nomenclature, Keats ably aced his apothecary's license, so he couldn't leave poetry behind. He had Wordsworth's 1815 poems with him during the years of his study at Guy's. As Benjamin Hayden was drawing his profile on a November evening in 1816, Keats recited a passage lovingly memorized from the Excursion about the, quote, expansive and animating principle of the religions of antiquity. That's a phrase from Hazlitt, and Hazlitt had admired this very passage in his review of the poems for the Examiner in August 1814. Keats was a student of poetry in this way, too. Also on his shelf was always Shakespeare, Chatterton and the contemporaries, Hunt and Byron, even a glance at Catherine Phillips, 17th century Anglo-Welsh poet, and his near contemporary, Mary Todd. Keats was testing his own hand at poetry, churning out that little jewel in Spenserian stanzas, imitation of Spenser in 1814. By 1815, at Guy's, he was affecting the poet, recalled a fellow student, a la Byron, disdaining tidy neckwear for a casual collar and ribbon, and occasionally sporting a mustache. So this was, Keats anticipating his punk future. It was a performance of being a poet. Through Clark's introductions, he was soon a regular at Leigh Hunt's convivial salons, along with Hazlitt, Godwin, Shelley's, and Lamb's. Keats saw his first volume, titled Plainly but Purposefully Poems, emerge on March 3rd, 1817. One of the best nonpartisan notices expressed delight in a poetic style that was pretty much a hallmark of early Keats. Vivacious, smart, witty, changeful, sparkling, and learned, full of bright points and flashy expressions that strike and even seem to please by a sudden boldness of novelty. Poems was in effect a presentation portfolio of versatile skill in several genres. Those Spenserian stanzas, several odes, songs, lyrics, personal verse epistles, album verses, romance fragments, and a sequence of 17 numbered sonnets with homages to his favorite writers, themes, and a project to refresh the old mythologies for modern imagination. Gaining legal autonomy on his 21st birthday, 31 October 1816, and cheered by friends and brothers, Keats gave up the medical career for a gamble on poetry, and Duncan has helped us see what a gamble that was. He was naively confident of a safety net from his grandmother's estate. 9,000 pounds had been settled on the Keats children, all 4 of them, but this was never realized. 4 years later, Keats could write no more. Now, usually a body of work accomplished before age 25 would be classed as juvenilia, or early. We always amaze our students, right, to compare Keats, to measure this Keats against some of the English poets among whom he hoped to be counted. At age 24, Chaucer and Spenser had yet to write anything. Shakespeare didn't get started until age 25, and though Wordsworth had 2 slender volumes of descriptive poetry by age 23, these were 34 and 37 pages respectively, these are read mostly today, if at all, by specialists. Lyrical ballads came at age 28. The first publication of Victorian sage Thomas Carlyle, who was born just weeks after Keats and survived him by 6 decades, came in 1824. Keats no more, and Carlyle on the cusp of 30, and it was just a translation of Wilhelm Meister. So Keats's emergence as a poet was precocious. However, it was no less precocious than it was political, partly by force of Keats's enthusiasms, but also aggravated by historical coincidences. The day after Poems arrived at the booksellers on March 3, 1817, the town would reel at the news that the ministry had secured the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act, allowing for indefinite imprisonment before trial. Lord Sidmouth had presented the bill to Parliament in February, citing a homegrown traitorous conspiracy long dedicated to overthrowing the established government and operating with increasing annoyance and threat since the commencement of the French Revolution. He wasn't shy about tagging the reform movement as a specious pretext for revolution and rebellion. Oppositional journalists had few options. flee, retreat, conform, or grave prosecution and imprisonment of uncertain duration. The confluence of publication debut and legal suppression had real consequence for Keats, not least because his chief sponsor was Leigh Hunt, editor of the reform-advocating weekly newspaper The Examiner, and with encouragement from Shelley, both of them already notorious for political writing that provoked charges of blasphemy, treason, and sedition. Hunt's first contact with Keats wasn't this way, though, however, but it was really by poetic proxy. He had taken a sonnet for the Examiner's May 5 issue, 1816. This is Two Solitudes, signed just plain J.K. And this was pretty much an over-the-transom lob on Keats's part. Hunt used it for column filler, setting it at the bottom of the page below a grim report about the death of a wounded soldier in a hospital and the pathos of his sisters being denied a view of the corpse until it had been cleaned up from what seems to have been surgical butchery. Even so, Keats's theme, the solaces of rural retreat and friendship, must have appealed to Hunt. The quietly modulated beauty of the sonnet is the way, in a move that would really become almost a reflex for Keats, Keats fills out a seeming ideal, solitude hailed and addressed as the recipient of soul-weary escape, only to reverse it into antithesis, the cherishing of sweet converse with a kindred human spirit, whose words are images of thoughts refined. Perfect for Stan's interest in the way words become images. How apt, then, that the really important notice of Keats in the Examiner would come in a communal manifesto essay by Hunt titled Young Poets, about which you've heard a lot today. And this featured, in order, the kindred spirits of Shelley, Reynolds, and Keats, with a full display of Keats's sociable sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, the draft of which John Bugg has made a souvenir for all of you, and I followed up with a sort of pathetic Xerox. This appeared on December 1st, 1816, Hunt hailing the Brotherhood in song as exemplars of a generational break from 18th century poetics. Shelley was featured first. His first volume under his own name, Alaster and Other Poems, had appeared back in January and needed a boost. Reynolds, whom Hunt managed slightly to misname, had been a publishing poet since 1812. He came next, and then Hunt, with a certain amount of drama and a flourish, introduced the newest and youngest. His name is John Keats, the name all in caps, here graced with that full printing of the sonnet on Chapman's Homer. Impressed by this sonnet when Clark had showed it to him, Hunt was generously setting the stage for a volume of poems. He fueled the interest when he took two more sonnets for February examiners. One, to Kosciuszko, honored the Polish patriot Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who had volunteered in the U.S. War of Independence against British tyranny, and so quite in tune with the examiner's politics. But the other was in a strangely different key. Titled simply Sonnet, it begins optimistically. After dark vapors have oppressed our plains, this poet anticipates the return of spring and springtime hopes. Yet the vernal catalog concludes abruptly and without recovery with the poet's death, poet capital P, a mark perhaps of Keats's forebodings about the fate of his forthcoming volume. However friendly Hunt's wing was, Keats knew that it was also a left-wing lightning rod. With the defeat of Napoleon in June 1815, Britain's long years of war, a war begun before Keats was even born, had ended with Britain's emergence as the premier European monarchy. But domestic peacetime was not all that peaceful, roiled by economic depression, legislation that preserved the artificially high cost of grain, those are the Corn Laws, and consequent food shortages and widespread starvation. The extreme inequality of wealth and poverty, the call for parliamentary reform to represent the interests of labor, the extravagance of the royal family and its allies in the aristocracy were ongoing themes for readers of the Examiner. Keats had been a steady reader of this weekly at Enfield, and along with admiration of Hunt's political courage, he appreciated Hunt's poetics of sensuous delight and liberty. He honored him with a sonnet at the front of Poems that was just titled Dedication to Leigh Hunt, Esquire. While this was poetically rather than politically themed, lamenting a disenchanted modern world with gratitude for the leafy luxury of Hunt's poetry, Hunt was that political signifier. Even the too happy pagan poetics were interpreted politically as a coded rebuke to established religion. The poem that Keats actually opened the volume with, we know by its first line, I stood tiptoe upon a little hill. This is the first page. You can see it has no title. It has an epigraph. This could be a cue for a more leafy luxury, but the epigraph just above it, which Keats set in this place instead of any title, was Places of Nestling Green for Poets Made. For all the green, it waved a red flag. Its source, which Keats inscribed just below, is Hunt's story of Rimini. Hunt isn't named, but he scarcely had to be, because Rimini was notorious. First published in 1816, it saw a second edition from the publisher of Keats's poems, the Ollier brothers, and so in some ways was a virtual twin to Keats's poems. It was to one of those places of nestling green that Paolo of Rimini and Francesca of Ravenna, who was forced into an unhappy marriage to Paolo's elder brother Guido, retreat to read poetry, every day falling more deeply in love. One day, with a tale of Sir Launcelot and Queen Guinevere at hand, they swooned in sympathy, and famously that day they read no more. Refusing to condemn the adulterers and lavishing sympathy on their impossible plight, Hunt dared to champion erotic liberty in defiance of scheming fathers, the church, and the court. The Tory press went after him in a heartbeat. With multiple praises of Hunt in poems, most extensively in the closing poem, Sleep in Poetry, with its honors to the inspirations of Hunt's home, Keats entered the fray, and also took a direct political swing in Sonnet 3 in that unit of sonnets, the one with the longest title of all, written on the day that Mr. Leigh Hunt left prison. Remanded to Surrey County Jail for the examiner's attacks on the Prince Regent, Hunt didn't fold, but turned his cell into a place of nestling green, with wallpaper, a piano, busts, books, carpet, and even a garden. It became a carceral celebrity salon, its visitors including Byron, Tom Moore, Charles Lamb, Lord Brougham, and others. Keats had written the sonnet in sheer admiration well before he had even met Hunt, and had it ready to hand to Clark when he accompanied him part of the way to greet Hunt on his release from prison, which was February 2, 1815. Praising Hunt's political courage and his forbearance shut in prison, Keats also sputtered contempt for tools of a flattered state, a minion's grandeur, and his wretched crew. The cheer for Hunt was a principal's list. Keats's prospects were so uncertain that even after he gave up his medical career, he kept returning to Guy's to work as a surgeon's assistant. How poignant this note in Haydn's diary for 17 March 1817, just 2 weeks after the debut of Poems. He has gone to dress wounds after spending an evening with me spouting Shakespeare. Keats was acutely aware already that Blackwood's reviewer, Z, had already branded Hunt's new poetry cockney, that broad-stroke slur on poetics, heresy, vulgarity, unmanliness, poetic license, and moral licentiousness. The launch of Z's serial satires on the Cockney School of Poetry 200 years ago this month, in the October 1817 issue, arraigned Hunt as its headmaster, with a forecast in an epigraph of war on Hunt and Keats, the muse's son of promise, and of what feats he may do. Keats registered the mean rhyme, but not without a reflex of wordplay. Writing to his friend Benjamin Bailey on November 3rd, he too turned a rueful pun on Edinburgh and also punned magazine into a military arsenal. There has been a flaming attack upon Hunt in the Edinburgh magazine. I never read anything so virulent. These philippics are to come out in numbers, called the Cockney School of Poetry. There has been but one number published, that on Hunt, to which they have prefixed a motto, Hunt and Keats, in large letters. I have no doubt that the second number was intended for me. Keats felt a brotherhood with Hunt, for better or for worse. You have the sonnet that I'll talk about in a little detail now. The climax of the sonnet that Hunt featured in Young Poets, on first looking into Chapman's Homer, has Keats imagining what it must have been like to be among a band of brothers on the cusp of new discoveries. Reading Chapman's gripping rendition of the Iliad and the Odyssey in the company of Clark, who had on loan that 1616 folio, Keats recognized a vigorous tradition. The sea had soaked his heart through, a line that Stan has commented on too, was how Chapman rendered Ulysses staggering ashore, half dead, a line that had Keats exclaiming, thrilled, Clark recalled, into one of his delighted stares. Feeling Chapman's poetry, Keats comes to life as a poet. He felt it on his pulses as he paced the miles back home. And no sooner had he arrived than he sat down to write out that commemorative sonnet, thinking it through as he marked out the quatrains. We can see this on the handout. He pretty much got it in one shot, revising just one syllable, low-browed Homer to deep-browed, to get the cerebral force of conception, as well as for a better chime with the line's rhyme word, which deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. A conscious indulgence in retro-antique diction to link poet and his durable accomplishment. The sonnet gives a reading eye. Stan has called this a chameleon reader, a chameleon poet, 2 years before Keats coined this term. That play of consciousness that is in, for, and feeling, in Keats' phrasing. What it must have been like to be that watcher of the skies, seeing the new planet Uranus, or like Cortez, when with wondering eyes he stared at the Pacific and all his men, looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. I grew up in Connecticut, so I have to always train myself to say Darien rather than Darien. Keats sets both skies and wondering eyes at line ends, recruiting the blank page space as a figurative field of vision. He also entertained a great fleeting double grammar, that's a William Empson term, which I found really useful. In line 12, he stared at the Pacific and all his men. Cortez stares at both, the sea and his comrades, his excited gaze reflected in and intensified by theirs. Then, with a turn of the line that bends the grammar to all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, they all join in the relay. Marking surmise with a long dash into the page space, you can see that on your draft. Keats gives all his men, all 3 syllables, stressed only the faintest rhyme with the falling dactyl Dario to evoke a resonant silence. Darien subsides into a second dash, extended to wondrous discovery into the vast space beyond. Revising from the 1817 poems, Keats gave Cortez appetitive eagle eyes, more penetrating than just simply wondering. His portraitist, Joseph Severn, would recall the almost flame-like intensity of Keats's eager glances when he was keenly excited or interested, those falcon eyes, as if he were among the men at Darien. Blotting the page of this first draft, Keats messengered it over to Clark, who found it on his morning table. The best all-nighter ever, succeeded by the best breakfast ever. Clark showed it to Hunt. The rest is history. Hunt was unhesitating and prompt in his admiration. For Keats, the astronomer, unnamed, and Cortez are figurative company in the lore of first lookings, but also remembered company from his own exploratory readings at Enfield. There, Keats had received as a prize John Bonnycastle's Introduction to Astronomy, that was published in 1787, with an account of William Herschel's discovery of Uranus in March 1781. And there, Keats had read William Robertson's History of America on the conquistadors' cause for wonder in Panama. These discoverers are brothers in speculation. Implicitly in the brotherhood Keats enjoys with fellow looker Clark, and more broadly with his new fraternity of modern poets, looking back to Chapman's vigor and forward into the wide sea of 19th century possibility. It's not that the Pacific didn't exist before Cortez, or Balboa for that matter, or Uranus before Herschel's telescope caught it. It's the excitement of a personal first seeing. And so Hunt discovers Keats. His formal introduction of Keats with this sonnet was prescient. It's now Keats's most famous one, with lines, emblazoned in the New York Public Library, much of I traveled in the realms of gold. Noting that this young poet has not yet published any things except in the newspaper, that sonnet that Hunt took back in May, Hunt mentions that he has seen from Clark a manuscript of poems that fairly surprised us with the truth of their ambitions and ardent grappling. And as much as we sort of retrospectively constructed Keats in 1817, who produces the Keats of 1819, I think this poem is an exception. I mean, people read this and really saw something. In effect, Hunt was kenning Keats with a hint of rhyming company in the way his fate fairly surprised us, echoes Keats's ocean beholders all-absorbing surmise. Just after the unit of sonnet and the poems came the long concluding poem essay of vocational dedication, Sleep and Poetry, including a passage of Hunt-tuned satire on the musty laws lined out with wretched rule in the regime of 18th century poetics. Heroic Hayden hailed the flash of lightning that will soon sound men from their occupations and keep them trembling for the crash of thunder that will follow. But Hunt, carefully recognizing what he called an impatient and, it may be thought by some, irreverent assault, forecast the storm. His friend Byron was soon muttering to their publisher John Murray about the insult to Pope's School, and Murray's Quarterly geared up for a takedown review of poems in Endymion in one blow, September 1818, from notorious Scorpion John Wilson Croker. Z got there first in August, landing a blow with the fourth Cockney School paper. He turned Keats's call to arms to travesty, and with italics. This long strain of foaming abuse issues from ignorant, unsettled pretenders, flimsy striplings, unequal to Pope's merits or those of any other, and these are the italics, men of power. Fellow young poet Reynolds tried to buck Keats up, rebranding the slam as a merit badge. So much of endeavor cannot be directed to nothing. Men do not set their muscles and strain their sinews to break a straw. Well, this was all to come. But even in 1817, the publishers of poems, Shelley's regular C&J Ollier, had been dismayed by the ridicule of this volume, as we heard from Duncan this morning, and aggravated by the booksellers' complaints, jettisoned Keats from their list by the end of April. But Keats was already looking forward. The day before Poems was published, Hayden had taken him to see those Elgin marbles, impressive, mysterious fragments of Parthenon frieze sculpture that focused no little controversy on their acquisition by England. Byron called it theft. Keats suspended the political questions in his overwhelming astonishment, not only at the strangely grand figures wasted by time, but also at their unimaginable endurance in the slow time of history, and a young poet's despair at never making such a mark. Ever thinking through sonnet forms, as Stan does too. I mean, his new book is just full of sonnets that are just great. Keats wrote too on the marbles, or rather in the mode of the sonnet on Chapman's Homer, what it was like on seeing these mighty things. That phrase is in both titles. Reynolds and Hunt recognized the force of Keats's poetry, and a week later, saw to a double publication of both sonnets in the Examiner and the Champion. Another publisher liked what he saw. Unfazed by the partisan attacks and ever on the lookout for new talent, John Taylor promptly signed up Keats's next adventure. His list reflects his acuity: Hazlitt, Clare, Lamb, Coleridge, De Quincey, Landor, Hood, and soon the progressive London Magazine. Keats's entree would be Endymion, a romance epic pegged for 4,000 lines by the end of the year. Eager to acquit this new vote of confidence, Keats dedicated himself, taking leave in April 1817 of London and more painfully of his brothers, to sequester on the Isle of Wight, only to find himself in a solitude less romantic than lonely, his writing going nowhere. He went to Margate, an affordable resort on the southeast coast where sickly Tom could join him. Keats's moods swung wildly. He had a great first line: "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." But his own joy of composition was often frustrated. "The cliff of poesy towers above me," he sighed to Haydn, as if looking at the same quarry that had produced the Elgin Marbles. Then, in a turn, he could mention that when Tom read him some of Pope's Homer, the lines seemed like mice to mine. He could hearken to the trumpet of fame, then worry about self-delusion, sometimes finding himself in a horrid morbidity of temperament, as if he had woken amid the corpses of guys. But Keats kept at it. "I read and write about 8 hours a day. That's the ace student's discipline. Not begun at all till half done," he assured Haydn. And I've got that right on top of my word processor. Not begun at all till half done. When he returned to London, he circled widely. Through Clark, he met Charles Brown, a bon vivant and playwright, and a more sober Benjamin Bailey, another eager reader of poetry who was studying theology at Oxford. Both fell in love with Keats. Bailey quickly invited him to Oxford. Keats arrived there in September. They read and talked about Milton and Wordsworth, and Keats threw himself back into Endymion, finishing Book 3 while confiding again his exhaustion in occasional letters to Avery. Back in London in October, he completed the last book, number 4, in November, all the while corresponding with Bailey about the practices of poetry versus those of philosophical argument. When Bailey confessed a momentary start at Keats's advocacy for the authenticity of the imagination, Keats volleyed back, "I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. I am more zealous in this affair because I have never yet been able to perceive how anything can be known for truth by consecutive reasoning." Blending consequent into consecutive, Keats invented a new needed word. It's not in the OED. An uncertain self-accounting comes near the letter's end when Keats says that he tends to react to news of a misfortune having befalled another with a shrug. Well, it cannot be helped. He will have the leisure of trying the resources of his spirit. Then, hearing himself sounding cold, he claims that this is not heartlessness but abstraction. Then he regards himself in abstraction. "I begin to suspect myself in the genuineness of my feelings, as a few barren tragedy tears." Then he tacks to nearer news, weighed with the heart's affections. "My brother Tom is much improved." Within a week or so, Reynolds, who was the Champion's drama critic, asked Keats to review Edmund Kean's Return to the Stage. And the last part of my talk is about Keats's review and the way that segues into the negative capability letter. Waylaid by illness since November 24th, Kean rallied to play Richard III at Drury Lane on December 15th, one of his acclaimed roles. Hazlitt, who had been watching him in the part since February 1814, celebrated Kean's skill in capturing Richard's ability to show his mental superiority and power of making others the playthings of his purposes, especially in his wooing of Lady Anne, the most notorious scene in Shakespeare, perhaps. Kean's attitude in leaning against the side of the stage before he comes forward to address her is one of the most graceful and striking ever witnessed with this sequel. the frequent and rapid transition of his voice from the expressions of the fiercest passion to the most familiar tones of conversation. And you can see that Keats gets interested in that too. Hazlitt was also knocked out by Keane's death scene. The attitude in which he stands with his hands stretched out after his sword is wrested from him has a preternatural and terrific grandeur, as if his will could not be disarmed, and the very phantoms of his despair had power to kill. With this sense of vibrant attitude, Keats was primed for the assignment. In our unimaginative days, habeas corpus, as we are, out of all wonder, uncertainty, and fear, in these fireside, delicate, gilded days, these days of sickly safety and comfort, we feel very grateful to Mr. Kean for giving us some excitement by his old passion in one of the old plays. So Keats's review begins with a jab at the political regime since March 1817. OED credits habeas corpus with the first verbing of this Latin phrase, which Keats stresses politically and puns into a cheer for Kean's fully embodied stage presence. In a regime out to suppress speech, Kean's body was the force that spoke out loud and bold. This is Keats. The sensual life of verse springs warm from the lips of Kean, and to one learned in Shakespearean hieroglyphics, learned in the spiritual portion of those lines to which Kean adds a sensual grandeur, his tongue must seem to have robbed, quote, the hydra bees and left them honeyless. There is indescribable gusto in his voice by which we feel that the utterer is thinking of the past and future while speaking of the instant. It's more immediacy. Keats delivers himself up to the instant, feeling without the shadow of a thought about anything else. That quotation is riffing on Cassius's trash talking of Mark Antony about his prized force with words, if I could be so. Keats has his own hieroglyphic of words with this very phrase, of the way words pull in more than the instant of utterance. If Keats was inspired by Hazlitt's appreciation of Kean, and we can hear this sounding also in that word gusto, which had been a subject of an essay by Hazlitt in the Examiner in the same month that Keats's first poem appeared, I think Hazlitt read this review and remembered it in a lecture attended by Keats a few weeks on, when Hazlitt said of Shakespeare, his language is hieroglyphical. It translates thoughts into visible images. And I think Shelley remembered both when he wrote in defense of poetry that poets are the only artists to use language as the hieroglyphic of their thoughts. Shakespeare was also in Keats's thoughts when he coined the notion of negative capability at the end of a letter to his brothers around 27 December 1817 to talk about Shakespeare's business with genius. It's worth recalling that this now signature Keatsian phrase, and by our day so widely iterated and customized that many do not know this origin, emerged in a letter begun on December 21st, the day his review of Kean was published in the Champion. Keats opens with just a note on this review, and within a sentence he's on to another theatrical spectacle of the London season, Hone the Publisher's Trial, on charges of blasphemous libel, the proceedings of which struck Keats and many others as very amusing. Apparently, Hone was quite the card in court. But especially the acquittal just the day before. Keats spends as many words on this positive event as he would on negative capability. His not guilty is a thing which not to have been would have dulled still more liberties emblazoning. Lord Ellenborough has been paid in his own coin. Wooler and Hone have done us an essential service. A later account of the trial reported that the jury, after a short deliberation, returned into the court. The Chief Justice, that's Ellenborough, had the mortification to hear the words "not guilty" pronounced, followed by a tremendous burst of applause, which he could not even attempt to quell. It was a theatrical sensation. Along with everyone else in town, Keats had been following the proceedings in the press. Cone's crime was to publish parodies of the liturgy, of which nearly 100,000 copies had been sold, and which crime had to be entered into the court record and therefore again reported in the press. Now, to put this in perspective, John Murray reported that at the launch party for Childe Harold's Pilgrimage Canto 3, and it was sensation written with the separation, at the Albion Tavern in December 1816, sold 7,000 copies. Sales would swell for Byron across 1817, but even the sum of 12,000 during his lifetime amounted to little more than a tenth of Cone's sale of his parodies. And on another scale, Lord Ellenborough was paid in his own coin because it was he who had fined Leigh Hunt and his brother John, the actual publisher of the Examiner, and sent them to prison. So for his part, Keats was braving a satire of the gilded pomps of monarchy at the top of Endymion Book 3, that verse that would have Z calling for attention to this Lisbon sedition, and the British critic notifying the public of a Jacobinical apostrophe. So Keats must have been relieved of his verdict a bit. Now, following the news on this acquittal, and with some comments of disappointment on the lack of intensity in Benjamin West's painting, Death on a Pale Horse, Keats turns to the now famous conversation about negative capability, which he refines with a bit of wit about formal legal inquiry. I had not a dispute but a disquisition with Dilke on various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, in which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine, isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery from being incapable of remaining content with half-knowledge. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. Keats is impressed by Shakespeare's ability in embodied drama to convey the complexities of character and situation amid uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts. Not immune to the pressure for fact and reason, but vigorously open to what Keats' earlier phrases, as a momentous step of speculation. The remark about Coleridge has always been a mystery to me, given the 1817 publications of Sybil and Leaves, which Keats had, and Biographia Literaria, with many passages seemingly made for negative capability. My guess is that Keats felt Hazlitt's exasperation with Coleridge's reactionary turn. He clearly had Hazlitt's appreciation of Shakespeare's art in The Wings of this Disposition with Dilke. This is my last paragraph. The conversation with Dilke is inflected by reading, by Hazlitt's keen, and then by seeing Keene's powerful acting, and by Hone's political courage and performative moxie. Keats is considering all these distilled intensities in which language, sensual, spiritual, and grand, does not just speak beauty, but radiates it in complex circumstances. Shakespeare's beauties are not easy ones, but are immersed in what certain knowledge can't always get at. Such half-knowledge isn't anti-intellectual. It reaches, always reaches, for fact and reason, but won't grow irritable about it. It's what poetry is capable of, can call its unique achievement. The feel of not to feel it when there is none to heal it, nor numbed sense to steal it, was never said in rhyme, were Keats's rhymes of more than half knowledge and less than an overcoming sense of beauty in the last poem that emerged in 1817. No, he hadn't.
I wonder if he had.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that conversation on the Heath, right, which is when they talk about nightingales and dreams and everything else, yeah, I think that he would have changed that. I think, yeah, no, I think this is very much filtered through Hazlitt, whom Keats was reading, yeah.
Well, this was initially billed as a conversation, This is an invitation if you want to continue this conversation now, but I think we should probably
Yeah, this
open
is-
it up
Yeah, we've
to the
we've
group at
delighted them
large.
long enough.
I might begin with one observation. I mean, it actually departs from the beginning of Stanley's talk, and that is that, in effect, what we've gotten here are two versions of Keats's The Prelude. I mean, and with Keats, I mean, when you talk about the growth of the poet's mind, I mean, it's not about being singled out or something operating according to the logic of predestination, which is what obviously Wordsworth does and how he tells the story. Really, it's about destination. The only way to talk about the growth of Keats's mind, which you've both done in different ways with different inflections and registers, yours is a little bit more political, is to just watch him on the job. And so, I mean, watching that poet's mind at work on the job. So that.
I think that's one of my rhetorical question, why Keats earlier to the panel 5, I think it had more to do with the fact that Keats is a cultural phenomenon, that's on one side, and how that changes with time. But Keats as representative of what great writing is. It's in the letters as well, of course, the poems. And I think that's what we respond to. But even more, you see him making those changes. You watch him in the poems in terms of the often frivolous, often fun, or he's just staying in the language, then finding another way to go. And then tracing that at the same time, simultaneously, with the letters. Where I ended abruptly what I said today, he is conducting a workshop with himself. And I just know other poet before him who's done that. I don't even think you could say that Wordsworth has tried to do it with the prelude and all the versions and changes and fiddles that went into it, but we don't know that at the time. This all comes later. It's not published till after his death. But Keats is in process, and he's allowing us to see that work in progress find itself.
I think it's also interesting that Keats' medium for workshopping is correspondence, is letters.
Absolutely.
Disquisitions and disputes and conversation, and what Keats calls pro and con. And that this, the little nuggets, I mean, the sort of Keats signatures, negative capability, chameleon poet, all that stuff, are just one-offs in all the letters. He doesn't fetishize any of those or organize them into prefaces and defenses and things like that. I mean, these really are sort of concentrations of thinking and this stimulation of conversation with other people who care about poetry, who care about Keane's acting, who care about the exhibit, who are reading the Examiner with him. So that's the workshopping and destination aspect too. I mean, that Keats is really thinking in the letters, and I think we see that quality even in his highly crafted poems, that these are poems where the pulse of thinking, rethinking, satirizing what one has just thought, critiquing what one has just thought. It's the kind of pulse of an active mind workshopping that is the arc of even the most highly crafted poems, those odes of Spring 19 that we value.
They're all about mind.
Yeah.
I mean, one imagines how quickly all those thoughts in the Grecian urn poem are going through somebody's brain. I mean, in many ways, he simply is distending, a series of turns and counter-turns that could have happened in 5 seconds. I mean, it's always about mind.
Yeah, what's really sort of humbling about that is, I mean, we know that he revised Psyche a lot and Autumn a lot, but the other ones, were like Chapman's Homer. I mean, he pretty much, worked his way through it and got the pulse of thinking that he wanted. Then did a little tightening up of phrases and rethought some adjectives and things like that. But I mean, as opposed to say Wordsworth, who's makes revisions synonymous with composition, and then thematizes it and theorizes.
And, a revision is synonymous with staring in the mirror.
Yeah, well,
Whereas for Keats, anything even approximating an autobiographical imperative has a kind of characterless quality.
It always strikes me in his letters, concomitant with poems, is his vulnerability. He allows himself always to be, of course, it gets really bad with the illness develops, but he allows himself to be of that moment, regardless of however it's going to go on his own.
Always make an awkward bow.
Yeah,
the last
exactly.
Sentence. Surely there's conversation out here. Is everybody exhausted and thinking about how long to dinner? Which would be perfectly good response to.
I think we wore them out.
It's been a while. Oh, well, there are some, yes, yeah.
I wonder if you all have a favorite Keats coinage and what it is and why.
What, favorite what?
Coinage. I mean, something that, well, I always like the idea of a chameleon poet, the thinking that that's what you do is, and that's what he saw in Shakespeare, of what it's like to get inside the sort of, detailed wiring of a different kind of imagination, imagining what makes Richard tick, or what makes Iago tick. In that sense of, Keats could even do that of, wondering what it's like to be a billiard ball, right? I mean, that he could go grand or just, trivial and local. But I like that sense that he imagined his mind as having that kind of, elastic extension. Negative capability, obviously, is the signature phrase that, everybody likes.
Fitzgerald was a great fan of Princeton graduate, very fan of Keats, in a great essay called The Crack Up, that's the title of the book of essays, tried to define cognitive capability, and you may recall that his definition of it is that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold opposing ideas in the mind at the same time, and yet retain the ability to function. The next sentence in that essay is, I couldn't, so I cracked. So fantastic, so I cracked like a plate.
That's wonderful, but what I love about posthumous Keats is the way in which that becomes your own chameleon imagination of Keats, and that there's so much Keats language that you work through and sort of transform with the kind of your own tensile poetic imagination in your own poetry. Could you talk a little bit about the way Keats's language is that kind of resource for your own mental exercise?
Well, you've done so much work, probably more than anybody else, in Keats's diction, which is not just word choice, but syntax. Keats is, I think, unique as a writer in the combination and discovery of phrasing and concentration, the texture of the way language, I think more than Shakespeare actually, language can get energy out of a very small space. It's just amazing. And that's what appealed to me to begin with. It's as if he's reading his life into a sense of his own destination or destiny into that language. And it's such, and I'm really speaking at the level of making the language, that it's such almost tragedy. You feel that. It's all that like all the things. And that's what I think that's what for me. He's inspirational, that's for sure.
Well, I think this has been inspirational indeed. Thank you.
Well,